What is up, and welcome to Chapter 21 of AMSCO U.S. History, the Progressive Era from 1901 to 1917. As always, please make sure to subscribe, like, comment, and share this video with your friends. Thanks so much for your support for this channel. The Progressive Era was when the American reform movement really took off, when people started to realize the political and social problems of America, and they took steps to change it. So one of these people was Jane Addams and the Hull House, and it was kind of like the first instance of social welfare a little bit. Jane Addams basically started this house in Chicago, and it helped immigrants who recently came to the United States to get accustomed to life. So it provided them jobs training, English education, and even daycare, really just to help these immigrants get accustomed and get off to the right start in America. In politics during this time, Democrats and Republicans usually chose their nominees for office at state conventions, which were dominated by party bosses. But in 1903, the progressive governor of Wisconsin, Robert La Follette, introduced a new system for bypassing these politicians and placing the nominating process directly in the hands of the voters, the direct primary. So people would have primaries, and they would vote candidates or nominate candidates for their political party before they voted in the general election. And this was good because it overthrew boss rule, but these politicians, the greedy ones, still devised other ways to confuse the voters and still gain votes. And some southern states even use white-only primaries, such as segregation, to exclude African Americans from voting. There were also reformers who wrote books to try to expose sort of the bad social side of America during all this industrial growth. And one was written by Jacob Riis, who was an immigrant himself, and he wrote How the Other Half Lives in 1890. And it was one of the first photo journals, so it had pictures and words. It basically documented the tenements and the other bad things and horrible living conditions experienced by immigrants. Many books during this time were muckraking books. Basically, they were publications featuring in-depth investigative stories that intended to reveal the corruption that was sort of happening underneath American society at this time. And one of these books was The Jungle-Upton Sinclair. And this book basically exposed the conditions of the Chicago stockyards and meatpacking industry, which was sort of the center of all the meat in America at this time. And the public outcry that followed by this novel caused Congress to enact a bunch of regulatory laws in 1906. For example, the Pure Food and Drug Act, which basically forbade the manufacture, sale, and transportation of adulterated or mislabeled foods and drugs, because at this time fake food was also common. And also the Meat Inspection Act, which basically made federal inspectors visit meatpacking stations to ensure they met minimum standards of sanitation, because these bad meatpacking plants were making the environment and the workers really sick. Other reform movements during this time seek to abolish or reduce the amount of alcohol consumption in the U.S. because that was causing a lot of problems as well. So one example was the Anti-Saloon League. Basically, it was founded to persuade states to close down all saloons and bars, and they even had a crazy member whose name was Carrie A. Nation. What a great name. And he basically raided saloons and smashed barrels of beer with a hatchet. Another was the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and this was basically a collection of women who sought total abstinence from alcohol and for society as well. And of course, this totally wanted to reduce the amount of alcohol so people would not be inclined to waste their money on bars and saloons at this time, which was draining family resources as well. Progressives at this time also wanted to help children and women who were often mistreated at their workplaces. So one example was the National Child Labor Committee, which basically created a bunch of state child labor laws that were passed by a lot of states. And these hoped to keep children out of their factories and other workplaces. But ultimately, state compulsory school attendance laws, basically saying children have to go to school up until a certain age, proved the most effective in keeping children out of mines and factories, and of course that still exists today. Also, there was Florence Kelley, who created the National Consumers League, and basically they promoted the passage of state laws to protect women from long working hours. So at this time, women were paid a lot less than men, and they were also subject to more working hours. They basically wanted to help women and even this gender gap. In 1911, a New York City high-rise garment factory called the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory caught on to fire, and it took the lives of 146 people, mostly women. This tragedy really sparked greater women's activism for their rights and also motivated states to pass laws to improve safety and working conditions in factories. So this meant better ventilation and even a better response to factories, so like better access to water pumps and hoses to try to prevent this tragedy from happening again. Exits were also blocked in this factory when the fires started to spread, and that also contributed to the high death toll. Ultimately, people wanted to reform industry to make it safer for the workers as well. Also at this time, there was W.E.B. DuBois, the NAACP, and the Niagara movement. Racial discrimination was really prevalent during this time in America, so in 1905, W.E. DuBois, who we learned before, met with a group of African-American intellectuals at Niagara Falls, Canada, and they wanted to discuss a program of protests and action to try to secure equal rights for African-Americans, because obviously they weren't getting it at the time. And this eventually became known as the Niagara movement. And also in 1908, he and other members started with a bunch of group of white progressives, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, better known today as the NAACP. They basically wanted to abolish all forms of segregation and to increase the educational opportunities for African American children who were lacking in the segregated schools at this time, and eventually it became the nation's largest civil rights organization. During Woodrow Wilson's administration in 1914, there were also new business regulations as a part of this reform movement. One was the Clayton AntiTrust Act, and it basically strengthened what the Sherman Antitrust Act was saying about breaking up monopolies. But more important, it was for organized labor, because this new law contained a clause that was exempting unions from being prosecuted as trusts, so unions could together continued to advocate for their workers without being prosecuted as sort of like a business. This way, some unions could sort of bind together and have more bargaining power as well. Also during this time, there was the creation of the Federal Reserve Bank. This was also in the Woodrow Wilson administration for banking reform, and basically the president went to Congress to try to propose a plan for building both stability and flexibility into the U.S. financial system, ever since Andrew Jackson canceled the national bank. And basically, he called for a new national banking system with 12 district banks supervised by a Federal Reserve Board. And after months of debate, they finally passed the Federal Reserve Act in 1914, that's Congress. And ever since, Americans have been purchasing goods and services using Federal Reserve notes, which are issued by this federally regulated banking system. Finally, we'll end with the campaign for women's suffrage. So the National American Women's Suffrage Association, or NAASA, was created by Carrie Chapman Catt, so CCC, and she was an energetic reformer from Iowa. And she basically argued for the broadening of democracy, which would empower women and enable them to more actively care for their families in this industrial society of America. And they continued to win votes for women at the state level before finally they decided to change strategies and try to seek a suffrage amendment in the U.S. Constitution for all women across the United States. And finally, in 1920, they were successful when the 19th Amendment was passed. The dedicated efforts of these women and World War I eventually persuaded the two-thirds majority in Congress to support this women's suffrage amendment. Its ratification meant that women were guaranteed the right to vote in all elections, local, state, and national. And as a result, women were finally able to have a say and to try to express the candidates and issues for which they wanted, not necessarily which their husbands wanted, which was kind of how they participated in politics before. So finally, a win for women. Yay. So this has been Chapter 21 for APUSH U.S. History AMSCO. Thanks so much for watching, and hope to see you in the next one when we continue the story of America.